today Security Council. And I begin by stating the obvious. The member state currently holding the presidency of the Security Council, the body responsible for maintaining peace and security, is intensifying attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, including on hospitals and power plants. Russia, in other words, is grossly violating international law and the principles of the UN Charter, including through its illegal invasion of Ukraine and undermining European and global security and stability. We urge Russia to fully respect its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. All that said, effective multilateralism is too important to not be defended. Its values and principles are embedded in international law, the UN Charter, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in other words, in the UN itself as a whole. Effective multilateralism means ensuring that international law and the UN Charter apply to all states in the same way, that might does not make right. The European Union's member states are doing their utmost to live up to our commitments. We are financing 1/4 of the UN regular budget, as well as that of UN agencies, while accounting for only 6% of the world's population and only 18% of the world's GDP. We are the world's largest provider of official development assistance by far, accounting to 42% of global ODA last year alone. Our initial humanitarian aid for 2024 alone already exceeds $2 billion. Our funding to UNRWA accounts for over 40% of the agency's budget. We are committed to multilateralism not just in words, but in action. And we call on all member states, including those championing multilateralism so loudly today, to step up their own contributions to the UN's essential work. We're also proudly among the UN's closest partners in crisis management and peace operations. The European Union works in over 25 crisis contexts, providing mediation and supporting dialogue around the world. Despite Russia's grave violations, multilateralism still offers great hope if we defend it. Together with our partners around the world, we will continue to address the many global crises we are facing, from the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine to Gaza and the Middle East, from Sudan to the DRC, from Haiti to Myanmar. In closing, we pay tribute to the courage and professionalism of UN staff around the world, dedicated to defending the UN Charter and protecting those most in need, sometimes with their own lives. Thank you.
I think we need to be passing by every day around 9:15, just line up.
Yes.
9:40.
That's why I said.
So.
Here we are, every morning.
I wonder if anyone follows to see what the effect of these are. Like, who writes about
They
them?
do, they do pick them up.
You think so?
Yeah, they do. We have seen. I have received questions about them for the office.
Okay.
They are
Right.
You have all your women on your side.
I'm just, as you can imagine, I couldn't be happier.
Are you going on vacation?
Dear colleagues, dear friends, on behalf of the European Union member states and associated countries, I offer this statement ahead of the debate on multilateral cooperation today at Security Council. And I begin by stating the obvious. The member state currently holding the presidency of the Security Council, the body responsible for maintaining peace and security, is intensifying attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, including on hospitals and power plants. Russia, in other words, is grossly violating international law and the principles of the UN Charter, including through its illegal invasion of Ukraine, and undermining European and global security and stability. We urge Russia to fully respect its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. All that said, effective multilateralism is too important to not be defended. Its values and principles are embedded in international law, the UN Charter, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in other words, in the UN itself as a whole. Effective multilateralism means ensuring that international law and the UN Charter apply to all states in the same way, that might does not make right. The European Union's member states are doing their utmost to live up to our commitments. We are financing 1/4 of the UN regular budget, as well as that of UN agencies, while accounting for only 6% of the world's population and only 18% of the world's GDP. We are the world's largest provider of official development assistance by far, accounting to 42% of global ODA last year alone. Our initial humanitarian aid for 2024 alone already exceeds $2 billion. Our funding to UNRWA accounts for over 40% of the agency's budget. We are committed to multilateralism not just in words, but in action. And we call on all member states, including those championing multilateralism so loudly today, to step up their own contributions to the UN's essential work. We're also proudly among the UN's closest partners in crisis management and peace operations. The European Union works in over 25 crisis contexts, providing mediation and supporting dialogue around the world. Despite Russia's grave violations, multilateralism still offers great hope if we defend it. Together with our partners around the world, we will continue to address the many global crises we are facing, from the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine to Gaza and the Middle East, from Sudan to the DRC, from Haiti to Myanmar. In closing, we pay tribute to the courage and professionalism of UN staff around the world, dedicated to defending the UN Charter and protecting those most in need, sometimes with their own lives. Thank you.
I think we need to be passing by every day around 9:15, just line up. Mistakes. 9:40.
That's what I said.
I was looking in the
So,
How are you?
All right. Good morning, everyone. I would like to read out a statement on behalf of the governments of Ukraine, Albania, Andorra, Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Japan, Italy, Israel, Latvia, Liberia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Monaco, Montenegro, the Netherlands, New Zealand, North Macedonia, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Korea, Republic of Moldova, Romania, San Marino, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and the European Union. In a few minutes, the Russian Federation will hold a UN Security Council meeting on multilateral cooperation for a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order, against the background of its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. The topic of debate is another clear demonstration of Russia's hypocrisy. Today's meeting must not distract the international community from Russia's flagrant violations of the UN Charter and its abuse of the UN Security Council, while cynically attempting to present itself as the guardian of the multilateral order. We reiterate our resolute condemnation of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine and reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's political independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. In the true spirit of multilateral and international cooperation, we support the international efforts toward peace in line with international law, such as the Summit on Peace in Ukraine, held in Switzerland, presented such a vision. The summit concluded with a communiqué signed by over 90 countries and institutions, with the focus on food security, nuclear security and safety, and humanitarian issues, including the return of thousands of Ukrainian children, whom Russia has forcibly transferred or deported. Russia has also arbitrarily detained thousands of other Ukrainian civilians. While Ukraine continues to bravely defend its civilian population, we condemn the direct military support provided to Russia by the DPRK in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, as well as by Iran when those sanctions were in effect. Belarus continues to make its territory and infrastructure available to Russia. We call on any UN member state providing material support to Russia's war effort, including dual-use materials such as weapons components, equipment, and raw materials, to cease all material and political support to Russia's war effort. The Russian Federation's continued illegal actions and blatant hypocrisy undermine multilateral and international cooperation, demonstrate complete disregard for the UN Charter, Security Council resolutions, and the global non-proliferation regime, exacerbate regional tensions, and endanger international peace and security. We welcome the adoption of the UNGA resolution entitled Safety and Security of Nuclear Facilities in Ukraine, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is supported by 99 countries. This resolution sends a powerful signal to Russia, which has the damning distinction of being the first country in history to forcibly seize a nuclear power plant. We continue working together to ensure nuclear safety and security in Ukraine. We reaffirm our full support for the efforts by the International Atomic Energy Agency and its Director General to ensure the safety and security of the ZNPP. We also reiterate our urgent demand that the Russian Federation withdraw its military and other unauthorized personnel from the ZNPP and immediately return the plant to the full control of the sovereign and competent authorities of Ukraine to ensure its
Обычно включают. 9686 заседание Совета Безопасности объявляется открытым. Предварительная повестка дня данного заседания гласит, цитирую, «поддержание международного мира и безопасности, двоеточие, многостороннее сотрудничество в интересах более справедливого, демократического и устойчивого миропорядка». Возражений не вижу, повестка дня утверждается. Хотел бы тепло приветствовать уважаемых высоких представителей, которые присутствуют в зале Совета Безопасности. Их участие в сегодняшнем заседании подтверждает важность обсуждаемой темы. В соответствии с правилом 37 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять...
Council's provisional rules of procedure. I invite the representatives of Australia, Bangladesh, Belarus, the plurinational state of Bolivia, Brazil, Hungary, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Vietnam, Ghana, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Iraq, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Kazakhstan, Cambodia, Kuwait, Cuba, the Maldives, Morocco, Nepal, Nicaragua, the United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Serbia, the Syrian Arab Republic, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Turkey, Uganda, Philippines, Chile, Ethiopia, and South Africa to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2024/537, a letter dated July 9th, 2024, from the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, today, the very foundations of the international legal order, strategic stability, and the UN-centric system of global politics are being put to the test. It will be impossible to resolve the conflicts that are multiplying without getting to their root causes and restoring faith in our ability to join forces for the common good and justice for all. Let us be frank. Not all states represented in this room recognize the key principle of the UN Charter, the sovereign equality of all states. The United States has long, through the words of its declared its own exceptionalism. This also applies to Washington's attitude towards its allies, from whom it demands unquestioning obedience of their national interests. Rule America. That is the essence of the notorious rule-based order, which is a direct threat to multilateralism and international law. The most important components of international law, the UN Charter and the decisions of our Council, are interpreted by the collective West in a perverse and selective manner, depending on what instructions are handed down from the White House. And many Security Council resolutions are outright ignored. These include Resolution 2202, which endorsed the Minsk agreements on Ukraine, and Resolution 1031, which endorsed the Dayton Agreement on peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina on the basis of the principle of equal rights for the three constituent peoples and two entities. The sabotage of resolutions on the Middle East can be discussed endlessly. It suffices to mention Anthony Blinken's statement in an interview with CNN in February 2021 in response to a question about what he thinks about the decision of the previous U.S. administration to recognize the Syrian Golan Heights as belonging to Israel. And I will refresh your memory for those of you who may have forgotten. In response to that question, the Secretary of State said, leaving aside the question of legality, from a practical standpoint, the Golan Heights are very important to Israel's security, end of quote. And this, in spite of the fact that UN Security Council Resolution 497, which remains in force and which we are all very familiar with, qualifies Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights as illegal. However, according to those very rules, we should, to quote Anthony Blinken, leave aside the question of legality. And of course, everyone remembers the statement of U.S. Permanent Representative regarding the fact that Resolution 2728 of March 25th, demanding an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, is not legally binding. In other words, these American rules are more important than Article 25 of the UN Charter. In the last century, George Orwell, in his story Animal Farm, already presaged the essence of this rule-based order. I quote, "All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others," end of quote. If you fulfill and obey the will of the hegemon, you're permitted to do anything you wish, but if you dare defend your national interests, you will be declared a pariah and sanctioned. Washington's hegemonic policy has not changed for decades. Every Euro-Atlantic security arrangement, without exception, has been based on ensuring U.S. dominance. This has included the subjugation of Europe and the containment of Russia. The main role in this was assigned to NATO, which eventually subjugated the European Union, which was presumably created for Europeans, and shamelessly privatized OSCE institutions in flagrant violation of the Helsinki Final Act. The reckless expansion of NATO, despite repeated warnings from Moscow over many years, also provoked the Ukrainian crisis, starting with the coup d'etat organized by Washington in February 2014 in order to establish full control over Ukraine with a view to preparing an offensive against Russia with the help of the neo-Nazi regime brought to power. When Poroshenko and then Zelensky were waging war against their own citizens in the Donbass and were destroying Russian education, Russian culture, Russian media, and the Russian language in general through their legislation and were banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, no one in the West batted an eye, nor did they demand that their wards in Kiev observe decency and refrain from violating international conventions on the right of national minorities or the very constitution of Ukraine itself, which also contains these demands. It was precisely to eliminate threats to Russia's security and to protect those people who consider themselves part of Russian culture and who live on lands that had been settled by their ancestors for centuries in order to save them from legislative and even physical extermination that the special military operation was launched. It is telling that even now, when multiple initiatives on a Ukrainian settlement are being put forward, few people remember Kiev's violation of human rights and the rights of national minorities. None of these initiatives include these aspects. Only recently did EU documents on the beginning of negotiations regarding Ukraine's accession formulate a demand to this end, mainly due to Hungary's principled position. However, Brussels' actual capacity and desire to influence the Kiev regime is questionable. We call on all those who are genuinely interested in overcoming the crisis in Ukraine to ensure that their proposals take into account the key issue of the right of national minorities, all minorities without exception. Silence on this issue devalues peace initiatives, and the racist policy of Mr. Zelensky receives de facto approval. It is typical that 10 years ago in 2014, Zelensky said if the people in the east of Ukraine and Crimea want to speak Russian, let them be. Leave them alone. Let them speak Russian legally. Language will never divide our homeland. End of quote. Since then, the U.S. has successfully re-educated him, and as early as 2021, Zelensky, in one of his interviews, demanded that those who feel a sense of affinity with Russian culture get out and go to Russia for the future of their own children and grandchildren. I appeal to the masters of the Ukrainian regime, make sure that it complies with Article 1.3 of the UN Charter, which guarantees the fundamental rights and freedoms of all people without distinction of race, sex, language, or religion. Dear colleagues, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not content with the war that it has unleashed against Russia through the hands of the unlawful authorities in Kiev, nor is it content with the entire OSCE space. Having dismantled the fundamental agreements in the area of arms control, the U.S. continues to ramp up confrontation. Recently, at the summit in Washington, the leaders of NATO countries reiterated their claim to a leading role not only in the Euro-Atlantic region, but in the Asia-Pacific region as well. The proclaimed intention is that NATO is continuing to be guided by the goal of protecting the territory of its member states. But in order to do this, they allegedly need to spread the alliance's dominance on the entire Eurasian continent and adjacent water. The military infrastructure of NATO is advancing into the Pacific region with the obvious goal of undermining the ASEAN-centric architecture, which for many decades was built on the basis of the principles of equality, recognition of mutual interests, and consensus. To replace the inclusive mechanisms around ASEAN, the U.S. and its allies are building closed confrontational blocs such as AUKUS and other quartets and trios. Recently, the deputy head of Pentagon, Mr. Hicks, stated that the U.S. and their allies must prepare for protracted wars, and not only in Europe. That is the end of the quote. In order to contain Russia, China, and other countries whose independent policies are seen as a challenge to its hegemony, the West is aggressively dismantling the global system that was originally built based on its models. Washington has done everything to blow up, including literally by organizing terrorist attacks on the Nord Stream gas pipelines, the foundations of mutually beneficial energy cooperation between Russia, Germany, and Europe as a whole. At the time, Berlin remained silent, but today we see another embarrassing period for Germany, whose leadership has unquestioningly complied with the U.S. in order to place U.S. medium-range missiles on its territory. Olaf Scholz said very ingeniously that the U.S. has decided to place high-precision offensive weapons systems in Germany, and this is a good decision. And amidst all this, Mr. Kirby spoke, the expert on media, spoke on behalf of the U.S. president to say, we're not seeking to unleash a third world war. This would have horrific consequences for the European continent. A Freudian slip, as they say. Washington is convinced that if a new global war were to take place, it would be their European allies and not the U.S. who would suffer. If that's the analysis on which Biden's strategy and Biden's administration strategy is based, this is a very dangerous illusion, and Europeans must become aware of the suicidal role that has been assigned to us. Americans are holding the entire West at gunpoint and expanding their trade and economic war with those they see as undesirable, having unleashed an unprecedented campaign of unilateral coercive measures that are hitting Europe first and are leading to a fragmentation of the world economy.
The countries of the global South, Asia, Africa, and Latin America are suffering from the neocolonial practices of the West. Illegal sanctions, multiple protection measures, restrictions on access to leading technologies are counter to true multilateralism and create serious obstacles to achieving the 2030 agenda. Where are all those attributes of the free market where the United States and its allies taught everyone to follow? Market economy, fair competition, viability of private property, presumption of innocence, free movement of people, goods, and capital, all that has been jettisoned. Geopolitics has buried the once sacred laws of the market for the West. Recently, we heard public demands from the officials of the United States, the European Union, aimed at China to reduce excess production in high-tech sectors because the West has started losing its long advantages in that area. Today, instead of market principles, we have the same rules. Colleagues, the actions of the United States and their allies are impeding international cooperation and the building of a more just world. They're taking entire countries and regions as hostages, are not allowing peoples to fulfill their sovereign rights enshrined in the UN Charter, and distracting from the necessary joint efforts to regulate conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, and other regions, and reducing global inequality, eliminating terrorism, drug trafficking, and famine, and other problems. Of course, I believe that it's with good faith it's possible to resolve these matters. In order to stop development following a negative scenario, we want to discuss steps in order to restore trust and stabilize the international situation. First of all, we need to deal with the root causes of the crisis that have unfolded in Europe. Conditions for establishing a stable peace in Ukraine have been set out by President Putin. I won't repeat them. The political diplomatic solution must be accompanied by concrete steps to eliminate threats to the Russian Federation coming from the Western Euro-Atlantic direction. By agreeing to mutual guarantees and agreements, it will be necessary to take into account new geostrategic realities on the Eurasian continent, where continental architecture is being formed that is truly equal and indivisible. Europe risks falling behind from this objective historical process. We are ready to seek a balance of interests. Secondly, restoring regional and global balance of forces must be accompanied by active efforts to eliminate injustice in the global economy. In a multipolar world, there should not be any monopolists or in monetary regulation, trade, or technologies. The overwhelming majority of members of the international community share this view. It's very important to reform as soon as possible the Bretton Woods institutions and the WTO. Their activities should reflect the true weight of non-Western centers of development and growth. Thirdly, significant and qualitative changes must take place in other institutions of global governance if we want them to work for the benefit of all. First of all, this applies to our organization, which up to now, in spite of everything, continues to be the embodiment of multilateralism and has a unique universal legitimacy and recognize broad range of authority. An important step to restoring the effectiveness of the UN would be a confirmation by all its members of their commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, not selectively, but in their fullness and interdependence. About which form this kind of reconfirmation could take place, we could think together. An important work is being done by the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, established at the initiative of Venezuela. We invite all countries that still believe in the rule of international law to join this work. A key aspect of reforms of the UN must be changing the makeup of the Security Council, although this by itself will not lead to productive work unless there is a basic agreement on the methods of work among its permanent members. This thought, nevertheless, does not invalidate the need to eliminate geographic and geopolitical imbalances in the Security Council, where there's clear overrepresentation of the countries of the collective West today. What's been needed for a long time is to achieve a broad agreement on concrete parameters of reform, which will strengthen representation of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It's also important to implement changes in the staffing policy of the Secretariat to eliminate the overrepresentation of nationals of the West and their subservient nations in the administrative structures of the organization. And the Secretary General and his staff, of course, must adhere strictly to the principles of impartiality and neutrality as demanded by Article 100 of the Charter, which we are constantly reminding of. Fourth, strengthen the multilateralism in international relations must be done through other multilateral organizations, including the G20, in which is represented most of the global majority and Western states. The mandate of the G20 is strictly limited to economic and development, so it's very important that a substantive dialogue on this platform does not include short-sighted attempts to introduce geopolitical topics. An increasingly important role, based on the principles of the UN Charter, is played by BRICS and the Shanghai Organization for Cooperation. It includes countries that represent various regions and civilizations that are cooperating on the basis of equality, mutual respect, consensus, and mutual compromise. This is this global standard of multilateral cooperation with the participation of major powers. Of practical importance for multilateralism are such regional entities as the CIS, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Euro-Asian Economic Community, ASEAN, the League of Arab States, African Union, and CELAC. We see as an important task to develop multiple and diverse contexts between them, including with the support of the UN. The Russian presidency of the Council will devote a topic on its agenda to the Eurasian regional organizations. Colleagues, speaking at the Parliamentary Forum of the BRICS on July in St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin said that the formation of a world order that reflects a real balance of forces is a complex and in many ways, a painful process. End of quote. Discussions on this topic, we believe, must be developed without devolving into pointless polemics. They should be based on a sound analysis of all the range of factors. First and foremost, it's important to restore professional diplomacy, culture of dialogue, the ability to hear and to listen, maintain channels of crisis communication. Depending on whether politicians and diplomats can formulate something like a vision of the future, millions of lives will depend on them. Whether our world will be multilateral and just it depends on member states. The foundation is the Charter of the United Nations. If everyone follows its letter and spirit, then the United Nations is capable of overcoming current divergences and to reach a common denominator on most issues. The end of history did not take place. Let's work together in the interest of the beginning of history of true multilateralism that reflects all the richness of the cultural and civilizational diversity of the peoples of the world. I invite everyone to a frank discussion. Of course, it has to be an honest one. Thank you very much.
I resume my function as the President of the Council, and I now give the floor to Federal Counselor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Cassis.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, a more just, more democratic, and more sustainable world order is one that places freedom at its heart. Yet history shows us that there is no such thing as absolute freedom. While freedom is essential for living in society, it is only guaranteed when it is protected by rules. Rules of principle and rules of law. The right to freedom cannot exist without duty and responsibility. More than 75 years ago, when we adopted the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we drew lessons from the history of the first half of the 20th century, and particularly the two world wars. These universal standards made it possible to build a world in which the force of law would eventually prevail over the law of force. And it is in particular the prohibition of the use of force, a genuine paradigm shift in international law, when the world previously believed in the idea of a just war, that was placed at the heart of our charter. Since the adoption of the Charter, we, the peoples of the United Nations, have stone by stone built the foundations of our universal commitments. And we have tried together to build a better world, one with less poverty, controlled epidemics, humanitarian assistance for those in need. Many of us were bathed in an optimism fueled by the spirit of never again. When the Berlin Wall came down, we believed that the ideals based on the principle of the Charter would take hold once and for all. But we must admit that we have not been able to stay the course. Our optimism clashed against the merciless wall of realism. And yet, we know history is not linear, and that human beings have an unfortunate tendency to repeat the same mistakes. Protectionism, nationalism, symptoms of this global malaise illustrate a gigantic lack of trust between humans. Wars, poverty, misinformation, and geopolitical visions that are difficult to reconcile are gaining ground all over the world. Ukraine, for example, has been devastated by military aggression for over 2 years in flagrant violation of the Charter. For more than a year, Sudan has once again been in the grip of a civil war. And, ladies and gentlemen, 75 years of multilateral engagement have yet to bring peace to the Middle East. Yes, multilateralism is ailing. If the United Nations seems too weak to us today, it is because it reflects the too little willingness on the part of all member states to obey the law of duty that they have voluntarily subjected themselves to. We must regain the momentum that has held our community together for so long. Mr. President, in May 2023, in this very chamber, I chaired a debate on the role of trust between states. Trust is a key element if this council is to fulfill its mandate. To build trust, we need to seek out more dialogue, especially when there are divisions. Seeking out and creating dialogue sometimes requires creativity and risk-taking. When we organized an international conference on peace in Ukraine a month ago, our aim was precisely to build trust through dialogue. In Switzerland, for 2 days, around 100 delegations discussed possible paths to peace. By no means did we all agree on these paths to peace. But we tried to establish a basis of trust on which to move forward. And we are providing a forum for other discussions, such as the one currently taking place on Sudan under the auspices of the UN Geneva, or the one that took place earlier in the context of Yemen. As the depositary of the Geneva Convention, Switzerland is ready to shoulder its responsibilities to achieve a world order based on humanitarian law. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions next month, and I hope to welcome you all to Switzerland for this important commemoration, it is high time to reaffirm the universal validity of international humanitarian law. At the end of October, Switzerland will host the 34th International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in Geneva. Under the motto, Managing Uncertainty, Strengthening Humanity, the aim of this conference is to improve humanitarian response through effective dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, faced with an increase in wars, and the systematic use of violence. We need to believe in respect for international humanitarian law. While trust can be created through dialogue, it can also be created through a change of perspective. As a doctor by training, I believe in science and scientific diplomacy. I'm convinced that science can help strengthen the efficiency of our work. An approach based on scientifically established facts also strengthens mutual trust. It makes it possible to anticipate risks and opportunities for peace. During our presidency of the Council in October of this year, we will be proposing a meeting on the potential of science diplomacy. Dear colleagues, it is up to us, the members of this Council, to live up to the responsibility that we have been entrusted, whether by the General Assembly or by the history of our common humanity. I thank you. I thank His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, and I give the floor to the Director of the Department of Multilateral and Global Affairs, Ministry for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and Ambassador to the Caribbean Community of Guyana, His Excellency, Mr. George Talbot.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank the Russian Federation for convening today's open debate and welcome the opportunity for collective introspection and frank assessment of multilateral cooperation in the interest of a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order. In Guyana's view, such an order is exactly what was envisaged when the United Nations Charter was crafted. The critical ingredients can be found in the preamble to the Charter. A world free from the scourge of war, one where there is respect for fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, where men and women and nations large and small enjoy equal rights, where there is justice and respect for international law and the obligations flowing therefrom, and a world that fosters for all peoples better standards of life in larger freedom. The United Nations Charter, embodying as it does the fundamental principles of the multilateral ethos, has served as a framework and guide for the achievement of these objectives. It enjoins a sense of common purpose, a spirit of solidarity, and of inclusion. No country or people is to be left behind. As sovereign equals, every state deserves a seat at the table of global discourse. Each voice needs to be heard and respected, and each contribution valued. In the words of Guyana's most celebrated poet, Martin Carter, I quote, "All are involved, all are consumed," unquote. Small developing countries such as my own attach the highest value to an effective, democratic, responsive, and inclusive multilateral system, and to the primacy of the rule of international law. Our security, our very survival depends on this. In working to adapt the global architecture to the demands of the 21st century, the enduring relevance and validity of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter cannot be overstated. However, too often are they honored in the breach. It is incumbent on the Security Council, charged with the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, and by extension its member states, to be exemplary in their adherence to the Charter and to eschew any conduct that is inimical to the Council's mandate. But no state is exempt in this regard. States must therefore hold themselves and each other to the highest standards of performance and accountability in observance of the Charter and international law. Mr. President, as we have seen in the cases of Ukraine and Gaza, breaches of the peace can have consequences well beyond the immediate theater of operations. The Security Council must take active cognizance of these realities and, in concert with the broader international community and regional organizations, be more proactive in addressing the drivers of conflict. Greater attention to prevention and to the pacific settlement of disputes, as provided in Chapter 6 of the Charter, is imperative. Parties to disputes must be persuaded to seek solutions utilizing the means outlined in Article 33 of the Charter, including negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and judicial settlement. Too often is there recourse to the threat or use of force. The result is an increasing number of armed conflicts in our world today that continue to destroy lives and threaten the future of states. This is compounded by a lack of respect for international humanitarian law. In reaffirming the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, we cannot turn a blind eye to egregious violations. Members of the Security Council should not be among those undermining the judicial institutions of the United Nations, so crucial to ensuring respect for the rule of law and promoting accountability. Mr. President, the thrust towards a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order will of necessity entail institutional reform, not least of the Security Council, arguably the least representative of global institutions. The Council must be made more representative, democratic, and accountable. For Guyana, no reform would be complete without enhanced participation of small states, who, for the most part, are a force for peace and principle. Moreover, the multidimensional and interlocking threats and challenges of today require greater cooperation, complementarity, and coherence of effort across UN organs, international machinery, and member states. We must broaden our frame of reference and expand our toolkit to deal with the new threats that have evolved, such as those posed by climate change, cyber attacks, AI, disease, etc. Likewise, in the use of available resources to better address interlinked pursuits, such as between prevention and peace building and development and poverty eradication. Just a fraction of the vast resources dedicated to implements of war and destruction would more than suffice for the fight against poverty or hunger or disease or the combat of climate change, indeed, for the promotion of sustainable peace in our world. Finally, on the question of trust among member states, within the Security Council, or wherever, this question is not new, nor is the answer. Trust is ultimately based on performance, the honoring of commitments, the assumption of responsibilities, the discharge of obligations. It is fostered by promoting real understanding and dialogue. Across the multitude of commitments, undertakings, and obligations, whether in the UN Charter, the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, or in the many other instruments, resolutions, and declarations adopted by these United Nations or beyond, a credibility gap exists that must be closed. I end, Mr. President, as the Charter begins. We, the peoples, their trust, their hopes, their aspirations, their expectations are ultimately what matters most. It must be acknowledged that the adversarial nature of contemporary politics makes it impossible to fulfill our global commitments and meet the expectations of our people. States must demonstrate by their actions that they are reliable and trustworthy partners committed to working together for the greater good of all. I thank you.
Я благодарю его.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Talbot for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, first I thank Russia for organizing this open debate, and I thank His Excellency Sergei Lavrov for coming from Moscow to chair this important meeting. Excellencies, this debate is very timely. Timely because our Council continues to struggle to find solutions to too many conflicts and crises, including in Palestine, where genocide is being committed as we speak. I hope this debate will help our Council to be more effective and less polarized. Mr. President, multilateral cooperation is not something new. There were instances of multilateralism through military alliances, treaties, and trade routes in the Mediterranean region and elsewhere during ancient times. While this may not fit the modern definition of multilateral cooperation, it illustrates the idea of various entities coming together for common purposes. Today, we cannot imagine a world without multilateral cooperation. It is essential for addressing complex global issues that no single country can solve alone. It also allows governments to pool resources, share knowledge, and develop joint solutions. As Council's members, this is precisely what we try to do every time we enter this chamber. Mr. President, multilateral cooperation faces multiple challenges. This requires the UN to adapt to emerging realities with multiple centers of power and to enhance its role in establishing a just, democratic, and sustainable international order. My delegation firmly believes that reforming the Security Council would increase the legitimacy of this UN organ. In this regard, expanding the Council's membership and prioritizing the historical injustice done to Africa will be a milestone. The open debate that will be held next month under the Sierra Leone Presidency will allow us to discuss this issue further. In the meantime, the IGN's contribution to the Pact of the Future is an important step in the right direction. We thank the IGN's co-chairs, the permanent representative of Austria and Kuwait. Mr. President, regarding the opportunities we shall not miss, first and foremost, we have the 2030 Agenda. It represents a universal framework that addresses poverty, environmental degradation, and economic inequalities. And let's not forget that this agenda calls for the full realization of the right to self-determination of people living under colonial and foreign occupation. With less than 1/5 of the target on track, the world is failing to deliver on the SDGs promise, urgent actions is needed. Excellencies, Algeria believes that to reestablish an atmosphere of trust in the UN, and in particular with this Council, we require more efforts to foster mutual respect, transparency, inclusivity, and openness. To that end, we must abide by and prioritize diplomacy and dialogue, transparency, mutual understanding, peaceful settlement of disputes. We also need to give priority to conflict prevention and peace building by addressing the root causes. Last but not the least, we need to uphold international law and the UN Charter as guiding principles. We must ensure that the Council's decisions and actions adhere to these principles and contribute to global peace and stability. Our compass shall be avoiding the selective application of international law. Dear colleagues, as the Summit of the Future approach, let's work to make this event a real Summit of the Future, not a Summit of the past. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for a statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. The world of 2024 looks very different to the world of 1945, but the challenges we face are no less stark. More countries globally are engaged in conflicts than at any time since the Second World War. We're facing a climate crisis, and scientific and technological breakthroughs are raising new questions which we need to answer. A UN fit for the 21st century is vital to meet these challenges. I'd like to make 3 points. First, we need reinvigorated systems that are more inclusive and more responsive to deliver on these important priorities, including the Sustainable Development Goals and international financial architecture reform. That is why the UK is committed to making a success of the Summit of the Future in September and realising its potential to set a new, ambitious course for the UN. We also recognise that members sitting around this table need to be more representative of the world today, and that is why we have long supported Security Council reform. Second, we need to ensure that this Council delivers on its mandate to uphold international peace and security. We regret that recent Council resolutions 2735 and 2736, calling for a ceasefire deal in Gaza and de-escalation in and around El Fasher in Sudan, have yet to be fully implemented. We call on all parties to do their utmost to see these resolutions implemented to prevent further human suffering. We as Council members also have a responsibility to uphold our own commitments. It is therefore vital that the Russian government stops sourcing weapons from DPRK in violation of UN Security Council resolutions and stops its attempts to disrupt UN work in Africa, including by stopping Russian proxies' targeted actions against MINUSCA. Third, we must defend the UN Charter. President, while you tell us how you believe the world order can become more just, democratic, and sustainable, your military is systematically bombing civilians in Ukraine in an unprovoked war of aggression and in flagrant violation of the UN Charter. What is just about trying to annex another country's land? What is democratic about trying to subjugate another country's people? What is sustainable about waging a war that has killed or injured over 500,000 of your own people? The war in Ukraine is a stark reminder of what kind of world order Russia really wants. A world where might is right and powerful countries can bully and invade others with impunity. The UK will not accept such a world. We will continue to stand staunchly behind Ukraine. We will support its aspiration for a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and international law, and its demand for accountability. We will continue to be a tireless advocate for effective multilateralism and for the principles at the heart of the UN Charter. I thank you.
Благодарю.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this timely debate on multilateral cooperation in the interest of a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order. Sierra Leone welcomes the debate not only in view of the forthcoming 80th anniversary of the United Nations, the most essential multilateral institution of our time, but also because it offers the opportunity to rethink and reshape our cooperation framework on the basis of equity, democracy, and sustainability. Today, more than ever, our collective efforts are essential in navigating the complexities of our interconnected world. The challenges we face, ranging from climate change to global health crisis, from conflict to economic inequalities, are beyond the capacity of any single nation to resolve. They demand a robust, coordinated, and inclusive multilateral approach. Currently, the 193 member states of the United Nations, from diverse regions and cultures, evoke a strong statement of recognition by member states of the importance of the multilateral system founded on international law to safeguard the sovereignty and independence of states and to advance and defend common and critical interests. We should therefore resolve to use this unity in diversity to achieve the purposes of the organization, to maintain international peace and security, promote and protect fundamental human rights, and cooperate to achieve sustainable development. Presently, we are, however, challenged to generate innovative ideas and credible mechanisms that will bring all conflict to a peaceful end, maintain peace and security, promote social progress, human rights and fundamental freedoms, and secure better standards of life for humanity. We have limited options or any other alternative other than to strengthen multilateralism based on the UN Charter and international law to address these challenges. This Council should, in this regard, reflect on reform measures that will reinforce our collective obligation to uphold the purposes and principles upon which our organization was founded as enshrined in the UN Charter. We cannot champion a just, democratic, and sustainable world when Africa, a continent on which more than half of the discussions of the Security Council are based, remains excluded in the permanent category and underrepresented in the non-permanent category in the organ with primary responsibility and binding decision powers on matters of international peace and security. The historical injustice against Africa must be redressed, and we look forward to the debate on this important issue during Sierra Leone's presidency